Ladies and gentlemen, I have another episode of Prototype here, and this time I brought a homie. What's up, Veek?
Welcome.
Welcome indeed. That's actually the emoji next to your name, since we have that technology now.
Exactly.
So. Perfect.
Thanks to HelltRYKS.
Yeah, he boosted
Big
the
shout
server. Big shout out. Now we just have fucking emoji next to everybody's name. This is a brave new world. Things that you never thought were possible are possible. Just like Prototype not being a solo podcast for at least one episode. So welcome, Veek. I'm happy to have you. And we're going to be going through a couple of different topics here, and they're all going to be in some way related to Zerg, as you might imagine, based on the title, which is called Zerghereq7. So I kind of, covering all bases. If you know, you know. If you understand that title, if you can parse it, then you know what exactly this is. Absolutely zero clickbait involved. So I should mention that our first topic here is actually going to be related to a Substack article, at least in part, that I had written on tutorials, since I know that you had read that, Veek. And we had some back and forth a little bit about, what makes sense for an RTS tutorial or whatever. And obviously, part of that Substack article did explain that, well, because this is for a mod for a game that has been out for years and decades, it's probably pretty good for the, it's sensible anyway for the idea that this is totally fine. Everything's good. We don't need to be as detailed with our onboarding. We can focus a little bit more on the new stuff that is going to be surprising to Broodwar players.
Basically, you don't have to teach people how to use the keyboard and mouse
if
they are coming from StarCraft 1. If someone's playing StarCraft 1, they probably do know how to use the keyboard. It's not like it's League of Legends or something, a modern game. It's actually something pretty hardcore at this point, so...
Yes.
Most people will know their shit, but...
And would you say that you had the biggest concern that you might have had with such a plan that I had outlined was that it might not be welcoming enough for new people, fittingly enough, considering your emoji?
Welcome. Well, so I was thinking about it more from an full RTS perspective, what we would do when we do our first game or whatever, or Cosmonarchy Retail. It's it feels like a lot of things are... I mean, you yourself mentioned it in the article that this is specifically for this mod, for this hardcore game, so we don't have the responsibility to teach everything to the player. We just have to show some of the differences. We need to establish that the game is hard and it expects you to lose and improve, right?
Yeah, right.
So I think that it's perfect for that, but when we have a full game, I was worried that omitting some things and just pushing people to deep water could not be that great of a learning experience, since basically from what I know from the flow state, and there's this graph you can probably add in later, where there's the flow state is the middle. And then on the top, there's it's too difficult for me to be able to be in the flow state and really learn the most I can. And then there's also boredom at the bottom, where it's too easy and I will not learn anything because I just don't get enough feedback. I don't get challenge enough, right?
Mm-hmm.
So this is basically my biggest thing that my thoughts at the moment when I was reading it. This might not be perfect for normal RTS, but it's probably ideal for what we have in CMBW.
And I have a feeling that if we could get past the issues with the intro to RTS, welcome to playing with the mouse and keyboard kind of deal, if we could have that as a separate thing, like a control scheme tutorial, essentially, which we do plan for our actual games, the question would then be okay, we have that. Now we can start to do the tutorial plan that I had outlined, where it actually does sort of teach you how to lose, but in a way that's going to educate you to the point where you can win, that sort of thing. So that's sort of what I was getting at, really, I think, is the more I meditate on stuff that I write or that I say, it comes out a little bit more clearly every time I restate it. And it's that the plan for the tutorial is to empower players to not shirk away from failure, and instead to say, okay, well, losing, having been defeated by an opponent that outplayed me is kind of expected, especially for such a hardcore game, or a hardcore genre, I guess, gameplay genre. You expect to, lose if it's a game of 1v1 and you're going up against a player who is more familiar than you or better than you in some other way, mechanically perhaps. then yeah, there's going to be this asymmetry in skill, and that will manifest in the outcome of the game. So rather than like have this totally disconnected experience that you normally have from playing tutorials and single player content in general, where you're not really fighting against somebody who's playing the real game, and thus you yourself are not playing the real game, my thought was, if we are always having them play the real game, even in the tutorials, then they'll actually be able to channel their experience in that environment towards either more challenging single player content, cooperative content where they don't feel like they're a weakness for their allies, and also potentially multiplayer, player versus player, where they're actually going to be taking on enemies or maybe playing team games against other players, and again don't feel like a weakness. So I feel like all of those things make a lot of sense to try to instill within the player and instantiate within the player. Like, yeah, our tutorials should engender some sort of sense of this must be done, and it's going to take a while for you to be able to do it properly, per se, or at least to the par that is set by even something like the tutorial AI, which, again, for those who are not aware, our plans is not to make it so that it's like absolutely unbeatable. In fact, it's actually going to be quite exploitable, but it's going to use aggressive strategies that force you to use terrain advantage, use defender's advantage, and really kind of study how an overwhelmingly aggressive opponent might have weaknesses. And, you'll start to build this understanding that, like, even if I feel like I'm really far behind because of this guy's strategy might not be the best for a long-term game, I can outlast him and thus beat him that way. That's actually one of the intended things, and even the dialogue for example, the Terran tutorial explains that, is like one of the characters in the briefing mentions that he had just been defeated by this training officer who was about to, face off against you, the player, your character, or the protagonist character. And the guy who he had just defeated says, that was a long game. You should be able to, he's got to be tired. You should be able to outlast him now, or something like that. So it's sort of like giving you this hint that, like,
right.
There's a little bit of something there.
A lot of potential for dialogue to really help players internalize the knowledge they implicitly learned by playing, right? Where maybe it's not so obvious for a newcomer that dealing economical damage in a campaign mission is actually rewarding, right? And maybe if they haven't really experienced RTS genre, maybe they're coming from MOBA and just like this game was like recommended to them by friends or whatever, they could still learn something by like intelligent usage of dialogue exposed to them, right? And I think that that's definitely useful. But one thing I was particularly worried about, besides the thing that I mentioned, is the amount of like basically the knowledge gap that you get when first starting, because there's like so many things you have to learn. You might not necessarily even know what things you can build and how do they work. So like the first few time you play, you probably wouldn't even know what things you can place. You wouldn't probably know that you can place bunkers, or although yes, you start with neutral bunkers, which is really helpful. They probably wouldn't know which military units they can produce and stuff like that. They probably don't know what Vespin gas can be spent on, and just things like that, right? So I'm not entirely sure how you'd want to, like, how would you organically expose that to the player without it being too fast or too handholdy, right? So
yeah,
not exactly sure on that.
It's almost like we would need, because there was something that Mesk had written out, Escatu Mesk had written a document that was like essentially supposed to be a plan for a video that introduced Cosmonarchy Brood War to people. And it wasn't a complete plan, but there were some ideas of like, you see Terrans like building an anchor by a cliff, and then some Zerg units try to attack up into it, and the range difference is demonstrated. And like while that's happening, there would be commentary saying like, instead of RNG affecting units attacking up cliffs, you have cliff advantage provided to the range of the attackers that are advantaged. So stuff like that, basically, to communicate certain key details. It's not a million miles away from the more fragmented approach that I'm taking with the feature showcases and such. Like I did one on the quick targeting, and I'll do one on selection extension now that it's final, and the cliff advantage actually was going to be one as well, so that'll be one that I make at some point as a video. But he wanted to sort of roll a bunch of them in as like one specific primer that like maybe gives you at least a brief understanding and overview of certain features. It would almost be like we would want something like that, but for the game itself. And that, I don't know how you would achieve that in an organic
actually,
sense.
maybe. I remember that like Age of Mythology had this thing before you like play the race, or like a civilization type or whatever that was. Like, let's say the first time you play Greek, I think it shows you like a video of like them fighting and stuff, and it's like introduction of like, oh, you see those, like you visually you would see what different units do like on the battleground or whatever. So maybe that's like something you would watch before the tutorial. You would like see basically some battles taking place, and like you would hear like, oh, Terrans are very versatile. They can really like use mobile defenses to press forward or something, right? Maybe something like that could work. I don't know.
Yeah, one thing I was thinking about, I mean, you know that way back when the trigger system was first designed or thought of, even before it was done, one of the things that I had the idea of is like, what if we can disable the UI for cutscene mode, right? And then eventually, like, you implemented that into Antikythera, obviously, already. But the cutscene mode idea for me was something like, okay, what if we have, you know, a situation where in CMBW, you actually pan over, like, a battlefield, and you see... you start off by panning over like a like just a base being harvested from and working. And so you see like masons harvesting both minerals and gas at the same time. That would just instantaneously tell you, well, that unit can do that to that thing. So like, or to that set of things, right? And that would be an instant
you could
win.
have this thing where you like pan over the ally that mines stuff, and they don't use bunkers properly, and you see that, and it's like you're thinking, oh, this guy clearly doesn't know his stuff, so whatever. And then you're just basically deployed or whatever. You have your command center being landed there, and you start, and you're basically told to like do better than him to actually demonstrate your superior skill.
Yeah. If the briefing was actually an interactive video or something, and we could show like the guy who was losing, the defeated cadet or whatever, right? In the process of him losing, right? We could see like a start of him. You'd just see a shot of his like fully saturated base harvesting resources. You'd see, maybe an atlas in the background as like a big structure with like a lot of defenses over it, which would be like a subtle way of indicating that it's important. And then you might see like, again, like maybe he's like trying to move anchors around by lifting them off, and they get like sniped or something, and that's like a key moment where he ends up failing. Meanwhile, you see like a lot of different units being fighting, and some interactions being happening there, and you can kind of focus in on those. And I mean, crucially, if you're a returning player, you would see 0 supply depots anywhere, which should probably tell you their absence would be telling. And I feel like stuff like that could be really useful as like an opener. And there's a lot of things that you could pick out there, or just stuff that you could essentially pay attention to if you were actually attentive. And that would eventually tell you, hey, certain things are very different here. I mean, there's like a new Vespene node called the Vespene Ridge, and it's all that he's got in his starting location. And then like, maybe you don't even think about that initially, but when you start out and it's the same terrain as where his main was, and you see like the area where he had built his atlas, for example, and the area, like you see the same resource layout, and you're like, oh, okay, so this guy was actually in the same spot like that I'm in now, and so I can do the same things that he did. I'm the same race as him, and so on and so forth. Maybe that, like, in a way, would just allow people to click in a bit better. I mean, I suppose it wouldn't be impossible to stage something like that if we could actually disable all the UI and then, record a video of that and then like get it. I guess we would have to get it like rendered into the game as a cutscene file or something. I don't know exactly how we would do that. I'm sure it's possible to do that, and then we would have to like play that instead of a conventional briefing.
But
it would be that would be something like, the technicals aside, like at least conceptually, even if we can't deliver on that conceptual stuff, it feels like it's pretty neat to think about. Because I mean, I've also, as a general point, I think this is a terminology you might now be familiar with due to your work. Veek, is a minimum viable product or whatever. It's like, what is the solution that gets us part of the way there, the quickest, and like, but also, ideally, maybe minimum is the wrong word for it because it does imply almost like the absolute most shortcut, but it's like part of being viable in my mind is also being scalable and iteratable. So we have to be able to iterate on it. And to me, that means that, like, okay, let's think about what we can do here. So, like, yeah, maybe we can't do the cutscene mode thing in all of its glory that we wanted to, but maybe we can do the record a video and fucking palette it and send it in. And maybe we can't even do that.
Have a proof of concept, see how it goes.
Yeah. So
no, it could work.
We'll
One other thing that I thought about tutorials is that it would be really neat, and it would potentially even help with that knowledge gap and other things, is to actually have like basically drills that you can play that are like they are orthogonal to tutorials, but I would imagine they are played after the tutorials. So you'd probably have like three tutorial missions, like I think you planned, and then you'd have various drills from easier to harder. And the easier one would probably just familiarize you with stuff, and the other ones would ideally be replayable ones to not only practice the metagame, but also practice like just your mechanical execution. And I think it would be really neat. The meta stuff, the metagame stuff would be really neat. Because most of all of the RTS games and probably other genres too, I have never seen a tutorial that actually tries to keep up with the meta and actually show players something that's currently being used and is actually useful. It's always something that's totally like unoptimized, unoptimal, and would never actually be played in a mini game, in a multiplayer game. Not viable, basically.
I think the closest thing that I've ever seen is the tutorials in Age of Empires 2. That's a game that just doesn't interest me too much, so I didn't investigate enough to see if they were being up to date with the meta. So I don't know if those are like outdated now and like really silly. And most people are like, don't try those builds or whatever. I think they were mostly like interaction concepts for like hunting with villagers and stuff.
Well, some things don't change there. Yeah. So there's like this fast castling strategy that you always do, although I'm not sure if it was very well presented. Oh, I guess the builder was pretty viable. Anyways, some of them were pretty like universal, and some of them felt a bit off. So that's what I would say personally.
And so, knowing that, like, that's probably the closest thing that I can think of that would fit what you're talking about. And also combining that with, like, I think it was the second episode of Crow's Nest that we made is finish your game. It's like nobody does that. So yeah, it kind of makes sense that like eventually the meta spirals out of control. Also, I'm sure, I don't know this for sure. It would not surprise me if StarCraft 2, which did have some kinds of like drills like this, if those were like no longer even possible to complete after all the balance changes. Maybe they were balance frozen, which is in some ways worse.
No, they're like frozen in Wings of Liberty game states. Yeah.
Oh, yeah, okay. That's pretty bad because that's like so ancient now.
Yeah, you start with 6 workers still, and you have completely different requirements.
Well, there were like training drills like what you're talking about, where like you start with like Thors and have to kill mutas or something. I forget the details, but there's this big jungle green map or whatever. I don't know if it's any good or what. I played it a long time ago, and I don't remember learning anything.
Well, I remember there was like multitask trainer, but that was community. And there was also this other map from Blizzard, I'm pretty sure, where you had like 30 challenges.
StarCraft Master, I think you're thinking of?
Yeah. But that was space platform, I think.
Yeah, it was. I'm thinking of like something you would actually go to in the training. Like there was like a training menu or sub-menu or something. Maybe they removed it even. I don't know.
That reminds me of the Wings of Liberty jungle stuff.
Yeah. It was a jungle stuff, and it was almost like a unit test map, basically, where you just like have these scenarios, and you'd have to like fight enemies. Yeah. But I don't think the AI was microing, so it was kind of useless. I'm pretty sure.
Yeah, it was like spawn waves of units. I remember the Terran one was like you had one expansion, and
there were some that actually had bases too. It wasn't just units.
And it told you to build ghosts as part of your build order, so it was really weird.
Yep. Yeah. So that's the kind of thing that definitely doesn't stick with the meta. And I think that could be something to try to do for sure, is maybe update those training drills on occasion, like where necessary. Like basically like if we had a professional scene, right, it'd be like, hey, we saw this build in the latest Ascension tournament. All right, add that to the fucking drills, bro. That would be pretty useful. And maybe then we would need or want it to be like kind of data driven almost in the sense that it's easy to define what the new drill actually is. So it's not like
I imagine it would be. You'd probably just log some like supply numbers or whatever, or timings or whatever, and try to automatically give like the what next thing to build and what timing a thing, and it would probably drill it a few times, and it would say like how much. It would tell you like the percentage of how close you were to executing it perfectly or whatever. I guess.
Yeah, like how much time did you deviate?
Yeah, right. Could work.
And then other such things. So yeah, I think about that. I think about like there's many ways. Like one of the things that I actually mentioned in the last episode of Prototype, which I know you haven't listened to in totality, is there are a lot of things. Like I talked about how single player content should actually prepare you for multiplayer, but that doesn't mean that it should be multiplayer in terms of like every map has to be symmetrical and all the AI have to play like humans, and every map should be 1v1 or 2v2, and there should be nothing non-standard. Like. Yeah. There are loads of cases where you practice using these kinds of like drills, or Mutalisk Micro and a UMS map is something that Korean pros do all the time, or 2v2s so that or team games in general, so that you get like more unit interactions happening a lot, and you get to like get a better feel for how units operate, and you get more units in general, and like the fastest maps and stuff. Like I think a lot of those are silly personally, like the fastest maps especially, but I can see the value in doing that. And so in the same way, it's like, yeah, of course, why not have some drills or whatever? That makes a lot of sense for like, oh, this build order was spotted in pro play. Maybe, I mean, I don't dare to dream of a world where we could accurately automate the process of like downloading the build order or something and like throwing it in on a drill. Like we would need some oversight for it, and that's fine because it wouldn't take long if we do it right. But I could imagine equipping the system to do that and sort of like,
good work.
Reference.
We could even say like build order replay files or something.
Yeah.
These would log what was done, or worst case scenario, we can just make like a replay processor.
I mean, I could also imagine like the maybe.
And one thing that you made me think when you said the Ascension thing, like,
right?
I feel like it would be really cool to have like. I mean, if we automate it, it's even better. But basically, having the name of the player in the tutorial would be really neat. Like imagine the Shambler's Gorgro Rush or something, and you just practice that, and I don't know, you're just like a big fan of the Shambler, and you really like how he plays, and it's just you just like to practice his build orders. You found a lot of success with them. You want to drill them,
right?
I don't know. It's really. Pretty cool,
and then ideally in the drills, you'd be able to search specifically for like builds tagged with the Shambler or something. I don't know. That would be cool.
It's just like it also says like, oh, he took first place in this tournament,
right? Or like maybe it would, even. I mean, depending on how hard you wanted to integrate this, I could definitely see a world where Counter-Strike has like a professional matches tab, but it's just for the majors as far as like which replay demo files that they provide. But I could totally imagine like something in a game, like obviously we're using CMBW for this example, but we're imagining this in some Anti-Cathera game because it won't be possible in CMBW. But something like, when you search like the Shambler, when you're like trying to drill this, it might give you like, when you're selecting the drill, it might give you a list of games where it was done and be like, oh, he did this in match 1 and 2 of this game, something like that, That would be
replays would be really good because they would show you some practical stuff. I don't think we could really automate like the contextual things where like, oh, you would say, oh, maybe do like, maybe place this building at this timing if you scout XYZ, right? It's kind of hard to integrate it automatically, but maybe the players that played it would be able to add comments or something. It could be pretty cool.
Yeah, I imagine what would actually show up somewhere on the screen is the build order. So you would see even like comments left by the player or whatever. And so like that would also help. It's a cool idea, and I think that would also help with general player like drilling. And since we're trying to talk about like player improvement, for the competitively minded, they could do these drills. You said that you'd play the tutorials and then you'd maybe, not like you would be locked out of access to the drills, but in theory, you would play the tutorials first. I think it could even be interesting if like at the end of you failing the tutorial, your trainer says like, you need to get back to the training drills or something and like dismisses you, like as like an indication, or like, that's not just a line of dialogue. That's actually like, hey, if you're having difficulty with this mission, try practicing Terran openers,
Yeah. It's pretty cool.
Yeah.
And one thing that you said about like single player to multiplayer onboarding is actually I feel like you could even phrase the campaign as this big tutorial that you get.
Right. Yeah,
Right?
it could be. Well, like
basically, there's a lot of like scenarios pre-baked for you that you will be invested into doing, and you can do it at your own time, and it's fairly replayable. So if you fail, you get the exact same conditions that you can try to like adhere to, and just try your best to like fix your weaknesses or whatever. Right?
Yeah, if you look at like the plan for To Touch the Sun, it's that the early missions in particular are fairly stable in that you can solve them in a way, which is kind of like drilling. Like it's a consistent environment basically. There's going to be some things that are different, but because it might depend on like, do you defend your ally better than you did last time? Well, now the whole game state's going to be different. But like similar starting conditions and their play styles are not going to radically change. They're not going to like one game do a rush and the other game go turtling. Whereas that might actually happen in some other contexts where my plan for The Deepest Dream, which is a campaign I haven't really said too much about publicly, the first mission of that involves you up against like overwhelming numbers of Zerg. But like the first, I think I had planned something like the first time I had some idea of like an order, and I don't remember the exact order, but it was something like the first time you play, they play a timing push. The second time, then like they both just fucking bum rush you immediately. So it's like the first time you get like a little bit of time to play the game, and if you lose, it's like, oh well, now I know I have to do this. And but then like the second time, part of that learning is, oh shit, they can do different things, and they just absolutely swamped my ass with like a Zerghereq7 rush from 2 players or something. And then the third time they might do a greed, and then you have no idea what to expect. So you actually have to scout. So like that's the main thing that's being told to you is scout. And then like, you know, then maybe they like randomly between the rest of them.
Yeah, it would be really cool to have this like automated summary of like what you could have improved or whatever. But I don't know how difficult. I don't know if it wouldn't be difficult to technically implement, right? Because there's so many things that you can do wrong. It's kind of hard to catch what exactly was your biggest mistake that you should work on or whatever.
Oh, for like indicating that, hey, you failed to do this or whatever, as like a thing to improve upon, like a replay analyzer almost. Like, here's some recommendations. Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, I think there's definitely value in doing that, but you also want to make sure that you're doing it. You're not giving them false info.
Yeah.
So like, and if you ever do, even if it's like once every 100 times, it's still kind of like throwing you for a loop. Although I guess 1 in 100 is a pretty low failure rate, relatively speaking. But still, it's like you wouldn't want that to be the case. So you'd want to.
Well,
make sure
I guess you can always improve in things. So
yeah, I mean, like it might not be
too bad when it.
They might not recognize they might not recognize the worst thing that you did, but they might still give you some feedback that you can use. That if you did shore up, okay, then you're still doing something. But you might at that point have a better sense of like, oh, there was a critical moment that I really fucked up, where that makes more sense. And then like the replay analyzer bot or whatever doesn't catch that or something.
Yeah.
Yeah, some interesting
I guess
stuff.
Let's go to the next thing. So
sure,
we
yeah.
can finish in time.
Right, yeah, we do have some sane time limit on this episode, so I'm sure when people get to the end of it, they'll be like, hey, how did this turn into a 10-hour podcast? Well, now you know we took 30 minutes to do the first thing. So.
Yeah.
I did want to talk, this won't take as long anyway, I did want to talk about ZVZ because it was actually the topic of a episode of Pr0totype some time ago, where I spent a pretty long amount of time talking about like mirror matchups are kind of whack, and specifically ZVZ is always stupid. And I was contrasting Brood War a lot, and I think at that time CMBW's ZVZ had been like Zerghereq rushes and stuff, and now it's well, not now. Recently, it had devolved into like Zerghereq spam, and apparently now we're seeing a lot more diversity in general in some of the ZVZs that we've already gotten on the channel. But there's another game that I'm about to cast later today after this show that is quote unquote the best ZVZ to date. That's what Shambler called it. So that's an exciting title, and I'm looking forward to seeing what that's like. But I've already seen more diversity since toning down the Zerghereq a little bit, and I still think it's useful. So it really is just, I think it was like a statistical imbalance as opposed to something that was more fundamental as a problem. Although I do also plan a couple of other revisions later, like for those who didn't catch it in one of the castovers, one of the ideas that I had was when we remodel it, when Solstice gets a replacement done for it, I would like the blades to be angled down to indicate that it can only attack ground units with its cleave, and then its air attack will be something kind of like the bone that the Zerghereq7 throws out, but it'll be like a conventional attack, so it will only be able to attack either ground or air, whereas the Zerghereq7 one is like a passive as a reaction, right? So then actually evolving the Zerghereq7 to have the Omni target attack for the cleave, being able to attack air and ground, is like a really big step up then, plus you get the passive bone. So there's some element there where it's like it really feels like a very good evolution. But on top
That
of
even
that, it
feels
still gives...
thematic, where
Yeah.
like the unit is not fully itself unless you morph it to the better, more evolved version.
I mean, I don't know what the weakness would be by comparison by the Zerghereq7 versus the Gorgocore, because like the Bactylisk, for example, is better in terms of range, and almost always it's better in terms of damage. Obviously, like armor notwithstanding, because that will morph the interaction. But then there's the bounce, so I'm pretty sure it's always better for damage versus the Hydralisk. But it's fatter insofar as it has more collision size, and it's also less mobile. So there's like a trade-off there. And I guess I don't know what the Zerghereq7 would have that would make it like an actual worse unit, beyond the fact that it costs more. So I would have to think about that, because like maybe it would lose any.
Like,
Like
maybe it's just the fact they're not as efficient against like ground units because you have to, on average, spend more on them or whatever. I don't know.
Yeah, maybe I think they are planned to have like a lower attack rate or something versus ground. So maybe that could be it or something. There's just something to watch out for, because I don't want it to be like I don't want it to be always that like you're dumb if you didn't mutate this unit. Like there should be a use case for the original, but admittedly, the Zerghereq7 is like a tier 3 unit versus the tier 1 Gorgocore. So I don't know if that's ever going to be a thing. Like maybe I just have to accept that some of them are going to be replacements. But either way, that's something to think about. Now it does feel like ZVZ is
most of the time they
replaced,
so. Anyways. So
right. Now it's an interesting situation where it's no longer just always goes Quasrock, which is what it was before. It's no longer always goes Zorkis, which is what it was just recently. Now it's like you once again have to scout your enemy and see what they're doing. So that's all obviously good, but also like no matter what your opener is, you have a chance to error correct, and that's something that you and I have both talked about, right?
Like do.
Go ahead.
I'm still curious if you can do like a Quasrock macro game, but I haven't seen that yet, and I haven't played that yet, unfortunately. But it would be pretty cool to figure out a build order where you just like go Quasis or something. I don't know. But Zerghereqs are kind of, I don't know. Feels like you might go very wrong with Zerghereqs if they go air, right? So
well, the interesting thing about Zerghereqs, and this is also true of Legionnaires and Zealots when you're playing as Protoss, is if your opponent goes air, you can just A-move them because now they have to withdraw their air units, but your units do not attack them. So even though they're taking damage, they might be able to do critical infrastructure and economic damage to the opponent. Because there's nothing to stop them. They're not like attacking ground units, right? So I think that ends up helping in that sense, where it's actually, if you decide to go heavy air, you are in a volatile state. Yeah, you might be able to end early, but you might also get ended early. Even if your opponent is on paper supposed to like lose the battle, they might still be dealing critical damage to you while they're like in the background, they're like preparing, air defenses or something, so that your counterattack is useless. So that might be something to think about. I think Vorvicors, now that they apply Ensnare instead of the Captivating Claws that they used to have, like now Captivating Claws applies Ensnare basically. Now that means that they can't immobilize enemy units, but obviously the Ensnare helps them for surrounding. They can now reduce enemy attack rate, because Ensnare does both. So
that's cool.
It does mean that you no longer want to like attach 4 Vorvicors onto one target, which kind of reduces their single target sniping ability or whatever, because that would immobilize them in the past. But it still allows you to like benefit from surrounds. And now it means that if you spread your Vorvicors, like say you're fighting Dracodons and you have like 3 enemy Dracodons and you've got 3 Vorvicors, you want them 1 on each to lower their attack rate, right? As well as their movement, and while the rest of your Zerghereqs.
From what I remember from looking at GPTP code, you can actually also stack it with Ensnaring Swarm or whatever it was.
Ensnaring Brood, the Matrolith. Yeah, so I converted that because it was a reasonable suggestion from Fagudo, basically saying that like in a way by existing and by not being able to stack with that, the Azazel with Forecastle passive on Sublime Shepherd made the Minotaur feel less powerful in that one interaction because it just didn't work. And the same was then true temporarily for the Vorvicor and Matrolith. But I figured out a way to factor it.
I think the way it's done in code is that only Vorvicor can apply the tier 2 thing, right?
Yes, because right now it's the only thing that independently from the Matrolith applies Ensnare. So if you're attacking as a Vorvicor with Ensnaring Brood aura, then that's what applies the second stack.
Right, but you can't do like a Veeqhere plus ensnaring brood Hydra or something, right?
Oh yeah, I guess right now it doesn't take into account if the unit has already been ensnared. So that's probably like a very specific, but admittedly an error or whatever. That's just something we'll have to fix on the logistics. It's not.
I was curious if that was intentional or not.
Yeah, it's a little niche, but yeah. Hopefully we can fix that easily enough. Probably won't be too difficult. But yeah, so like the fact that Veeqhere's got a little bit of love based on that, the fact that Nathrikore's recently got revised to no longer splash makes them a lot less viable or volatile. And I almost said viable. That is funny. They got more durable, but they cost more gas, and obviously they're more specialized since their ground attack is less efficient than their air attack. But their air attack does get double reduced by armor. So if they're fighting an armored opponent like a Gorgocore, they're probably not going to do too well. And this is probably going to be true even when we remove the splash versus air for the Gorg. So anyway, there's some ideas that I have, as far as like applying changes to these units and like specializing them or whatever, like making them a little bit more distinct. I did want some generalist units to still exist, and I think now that I've reduced the cost of the Hydralisk back down to 75-25 instead of 100-25, 100 minerals 25, yes.
Doesn't just make tier 1 Zerg like an AoE air attack, right?
Yeah, right now the only thing that they would have that's kind of close to that is the Xibalba, since it has the multi-target and bounce, but it's not true AoE. It's not true splash.
Maybe some anti-air flyer could have a bounce or something, like Gorgocore or Naf. I don't know. And Naf is attacking with close, right? So
yeah, it doesn't really work for.
So I guess Gorgocore could have a bounce if you would really want. I don't know.
Well, it would help make it seem like it's a crowd controlling unit, because that's what it is versus ground, but it would accomplish it in a different way. So, yeah, I wouldn't know if like the fact that there would then be no AoE versus air would then make ZVZ very volatile towards like stacked air, because like Skithricores don't do the greatest amount of DPS. Gorgocores are now much slower than they used to be, and Nathrikores obviously don't deal the greatest amount of DPS, but they deal a little bit better than Skithricores. It's just that they're also much more fragile. So I'm not sure that the lack of AoE would be a huge problem. But again, like this is something that I reached this conclusion about general balancing. And this is also true for what I'm going to be doing with the Hippogriff and other units, is like the fact that air units can stack an infinite amount of damage into a small area because of the fact that air units don't have pathfinding in Brood War is going to significantly alter the design paradigms that are actually going to be workable within the game. So
I think you said they must be more of a specialist than generalist, right?
Air units in general have to be more specialist than generalists. Yeah.
I'd say that's also true if you'd have pathfinding, because they can still path toward, they are still like inherently more mobile because they can reach things other units can't more quickly, right? But yeah, that's especially bad with stacking, right?
Yeah, it means that you can no longer engage with them using the same kind of deals or whatever. I don't know. It does seem to me like it's a weird issue as far as like the way that splash works. So yeah, I don't know. Like it's not a very healthy interaction because it is so volatile. Like you could either be with a splash attack, you could either do the normal intended amount of damage to one unit, or that amount of damage to like 100 units potentially, because or whatever. Like in average, it's usually like
units and in reward basically get the ability to stack and snipe stuff, sort of like Mutalisk style from Brood War, right? But it's even more pronounced with units like in the past I felt like Skithricores were really good at that, but right now it's probably something else.
I think they had like one more range in that version that you're thinking of, plus they had probably a bit better attack rate. And now it's more like when we did a big stat rebalance to make the game less volatile in general, we usually reduced air unit range and then all weapon attack rates, while also it's like either their attack rate got hit or their like damage and armor pen got hit, and generally like armor pen and armor went to more sensible values by default anyway. So yeah, a lot of things got adjusted, and now I do think most units are better. The Cyclops was like an example of units that people felt had gone by the wayside, and the revision is pretty neat for them now, where they obviously are very different. But I guess to refocus us onto ZVZ, the issues that I had in the past was that, and this is true in Brood War more than it is true in CMBW, but it felt like there was really only one viable opener you could do, and it didn't really matter specifically which one it was, if it was Quasrock or Zorkis or whatever. So yeah, like that's the biggest problem, and that obviously devalues scouting. It devalues your individual personality and like how to express your ideas about the game and how you want to express your own playstyle. It basically goes counter to everything that we intended, and so it was clearly like a spot that we needed to work on, and it was like a problem area. And I don't know how much of this is downstream of the players that we have not being skilled enough to pull off certain strategies, but while I was initially more concerned about like making sure that the game was not like, I didn't want to balance the game around poor play, what I saw as like lacking play that could be optimized. I also have come to the conclusion that like sort of like the minimum viable product idea of like we need to just iterate on something until it's better. I mean, we can start with this player skill that is kind of normalized, where like the uppermost echelon seems to be like, you know, Mystery Meat, Shambler, myself, you if you play a little bit more frequently, right? Like stuff like that. And then Nablime is also
right now I suck. So.
Well, in team games, it's a little bit easier because you can kind of collaborate. At least there's that. But you know, like there's a certain level of player skill that we have that's like kind of collecting to the top, and if we use them as the example of like, here's how we can maybe change stuff, and we're not throwing out like the lower skill players. Like there's a video coming out tomorrow where Benno and the Shambler duke it out, and in the first game, Shambler basically wrecks his shit with Veeqhere drops. And I was thinking to myself, like, if you don't know how to respond to early game harassment, particularly very expensive early game harassment, you will just think that this is a broken strategy that there is no counter to. And I don't want to balance the game around people who think that, because that's kind of dumb, obviously. But at the same time, I can empathize with their position, where it feels like one mistake from the very first response to an Akantor drop, like that meant that they lost the game, or were set really far behind, which eventually made it so that they lost the game. To me, I felt like, you know, he didn't scout it. He didn't anticipate it. I mean, he scouted the embassy, but he didn't scout the sequestered icon, and just seemingly didn't anticipate the presence of drops. And so, like, maybe there are some things similar to like the Zerghereq7 case, right? Like maybe some aspects of, like, say, the Envoy's movement speed or the Akantor's durability, just like the Zerghereq's movement speed and armor penetration and attack rate, which were all reduced recently, and the timing of the Zorka's Shroud, which was recently nerfed as well. Like, yeah, maybe there are some statistical things that need to be, you know, dialed back, but I would also like to account for the skill of the players piloting it and the players that are on the receiving end of it. Because if it turns out that actually, like, this was fine, but we overcorrected, then suddenly, once the skill normalizes again... Yeah, it would be really
stupid to over-nerf a race just because it tends to have better players.
Yes, that would be one example too, yeah. Or, like, over-nerf a specific unit because better players tend to use it. Like, maybe bad players don't use Akantors because they're hard to control. Or something like that, right?
Maybe. I mean, I feel like there's always, even if the skill isn't that high, I feel like there's always some value, at least, from like exploring different approaches and seeing how they impact the meta game on our level. So, I think there's still value, but you just have to be careful, like you said.
Right.
And speaking of Veeqhere, I think we should add 1/256 chance that Protoss Akantor will actually be Protoss Veeqhere. I'm adding that to considering future changes. So, more than that.
There you go. Yeah, we can.
It's really good.
People
I
can
can't wait for a customer which actually has Protoss Veeqhere with like 100 kills or something.
Yeah. Well, obviously that means there should be the same amount of chance that you get Terran Ahmed instead of Terran Herakon. And like the unit corps should be renamed
that's actually a really good Easter egg.
Yeah.
So, should consider that.
Yeah. I don't mind it. If you can program in a thing that will randomly rename it, 1 in 256 chance. I guess we probably wouldn't want it in campaigns. Or like certain things. You'd have to have an option to disable it, I guess, is what I'm getting at. But if it's not disabled in the map, then yeah, it should just happen. So that means that, like, obviously all melee maps might have that. So yeah, that's pretty amusing. Yeah, we'll think about other names that we can. Blackjacks can be Highway or something. I don't know.
Pretty cool.
Dog. So there you go. There's some interesting stuff there.
Wigglehead Raptor.
Yeah, Zerg Wigglehead. And then, dude, the new Lyrilisc still wiggles. When he walks, he wiggles.
Yeah. Let's go.
So, yeah, that was a detail Solstice made sure to keep. The important shit.
Right.
And speaking of the considering future changes thread in the CMBW forum, actually Fagudo had presented recently a suggestion to resolve or to change things about the Zerg macro so that they basically they would be more in line with other races. We weren't sure if we agreed with the idea that there's a really big problem for UX and flow for when you like his complaint, as I understood it, was larvae generate every 12 seconds, but droliths take 14 seconds to make. So you queue a worker. And then 2 seconds after you get another larva and thus queue another worker, you have to then task your worker onto the mineral field or order them to build something or whatever you're going to do with that worker.
Yeah, so the desync he argued is a terrible UX because you can't ever have a very like tight macro cycle. You always have the 2 seconds you have to wait, right?
Mm-hmm. I can see the complaint, but I don't know if it's as significant because, this might just be cope, but I almost feel like it kind of teaches you to constantly be looking for like timing it to the larva and not having that be having that be agnostic to the unit is important because you want to keep your larva low to begin with. And so
so what I said to him is that most of the time you will want to desync your larva timer anyways, because you just when you have resources to spend, you should spend them, and same goes for larva. If you have larva to spend, you just spend it. So most of the time they won't neatly all spawn at the same second.
Yeah,
I'm pretty sure it's like not what happens in a real game. So even if it was the same, it wouldn't really matter. And so I think that UX thing is not really that big of a deal, just like you said. And the other thing that he suggested is to nerf the larva time to 15 seconds, but instead make the starting larva for a production structure to be free instead of 1.
Right. So basically it was overvalue or adding more value to larvae, making them slightly scarcer or whatever, in theory, because like they take longer to make, but then giving you an injection when you finish a structure, which would encourage you to build more macro HelltRYKS or larvasks or whatever you were going to make.
I feel like the biggest impact it has is on early game, where you can immediately queue to droliths, and you probably can spend the first few returns a bit better, right? Because you just have surplus larvae that you are not limited by.
Yeah, I don't know. Like, I'm not sure it would make a significant change at the end of the day. It does feel to me like the major... So there were like 2 main concerns, and one of them was that UX thing that we talked about. The other one was that he felt like HelltRYKS, macro HelltRYKS specifically, were like not used very often, and most people would just use them for Kafrlasks or whatever, like mutate them into the new version, or maybe the Gathalask at tier 3 if you get there. We haven't seen that too often because it's a tier 3 thing, and most games don't go there. But I'm told that this best ZVZ of all time does, so who knows what we might be awaiting. The interesting thing that I see about that, in theory anyway, is like, okay, we've got an opportunity to encourage the player to build more production facilities somehow, but I kind of feel like you would always do that anyway. And I feel like if people aren't building macro hatches, then they're probably not going to be able to keep their money low as Zerg. Like, I don't think that just one or 2 production facilities per base, that's not, assuming you're well saturated, that's actually not going to be able to give you enough larvae, even at its current spawn rate, to support that. So when you it is true that when you reduce the spawn rate by increasing the timer, you do then prioritize you being able to make more than you were able to make before. So that would have that intended effect of like making you build more production. But I feel like you should be building more production anyway. So I'm not sure. I wouldn't be opposed to maybe bringing the larva time up to 14 in the sense that that would at least resolve the concern about the desync between drolith or whatever. And maybe that would also nudge you into a favor of like, hey, build more production. But at this point, it's kind of entwined with the previous point about ZVZ and having issues with balance. We just got them into a spot where Zerg in general are pretty reasonable. And if we nerf them or revise them massively, I have no idea what kind of knock-on effects that could have.
Core to how they play. So it's probably good to leave them in this spot for a while to see how exactly this current approach works and what impact it has on the game, right?
The other thing that you had mentioned, I guess based on what you just said there, we should also make it known we're not actively planning on making any change right now. But it's worth talking about what's been talked about within the community, and also just interesting concepts and stuff. Now, you had also proposed, like revised or resuscitated, I guess, resurrected your proposal of egg slots as opposed to larvae, and like explained how that you thought that would work out better. I don't know if you want to say a few words about what you think about that, or like how you think it would help the Zerg thematics and whatnot.
Yeah, so the gist of what I said. So maybe first I'll say what it is. Egg slots basically, or I guess the Brood War version I like to call larva slots, so to keep it separate from what what cosmetic retail is. Basically, it's the system where larvae do respawn instantly, but until all, like, basically eggs also count to the limit.
Right.
So it means basically the larva respawn timer depends on what unit you're building. So if you build a long build time unit, you don't get to use that larva for a longer time.
Right.
And the reason I felt it's thematic is because well, there are a few things that it does. So it syncs up it makes the build time of the unit mean more, because it also makes the larva more scarce over the time of the game.
Right.
So basically, it does incentivize you to build more macro hatches the more you income have, which I find thematic for Zerg to have this much production, especially that they get all the tech. So basically, compared to other races, they get basically the biggest thing that they pay for is tech, and they don't really care about production. So basically, what I think is currently happening, which I might be misobserving or whatever, but basically what I think is happening is that the more tech you have as Zerg, the less you care about larva, and the less you really have to care about macro hatches. And also, it basically makes the more costlier units more larva efficient, so it kind of disincentivizes you to build the cheaper ones, which I feel like is anti-thematic to Zerg, because it feels at least should be a viable tool in their toolbox to swarm, basically.
Mm-hmm.
Instead of it being just not very... Like, it feels it stands to reason that something thematic to the race should be fairly efficient. Maybe not optimal, but just viable, right?
Yeah, I think that
sort of my take.
Right. I think that the observation that the more durable, longer build time units are thus more larva efficient makes sense, because right now you don't really care too much. You're like, the larva spawn timer is agnostic to the unit training timer. I don't know, that would definitely, in a similar way to like just globally nerfing larva spawn, that would definitely have a very heavy knock-on effect. I'm not sure if that would fuck up with like muscle memory, where you expect every certain amount of time a larva to be there, and that then it becomes variable. So I don't know if there would be a lot of overhead or what. Like, it would definitely require adaptation, right? For the on the player side, which isn't necessarily meaning that we can't do it or that we won't explore it or whatever. But like, also right now that would be a pretty big change too. I think that the idea of them basically converting larva from this, like, every moment, every X number of seconds or whatever, you get another production queue, to, like, it's not production queue on a timer, it's just parallel production queues, basically. And that could be the point of variance, where, like, maybe we add a third type of HelltRYKS that, instead of giving it, like, Gath-Talosk or Kafralosk, it gives it like more egg slots or more larva slots, and that wouldn't be as ridiculous to think about as you might think, because if it just increases the larva cap right now, then it's like, oh well, you build this if you're bad because you want to float larva or something. Like, it doesn't. It's not good. It doesn't do anything. Whereas, like, with your revision in mind, that would, and then maybe the Larvosk has 2 instead of 3 slots or something, so that way there's less production queues on the lower tier structure, and there's like more of a reason to build it. You could imagine like that being another axis in which to balance things. So I do think that would be significant and helpful, and I think it would be interesting to explore. But it might end up just being one of those things that is better left for a new game that features something like that, like the Orlithray and CM Retail or something, which is what was originally planned for egg slots to begin with. And
I don't remember if they differ much. outside of the fact that obviously in Brood War larvae are external to the building, and in Pr0totype it would be internal.
Yeah, you
to the
just can't
building,
attack
so-
the eggs, basically. I wasn't sure if I wanted them to be hard points where you could like attack them instead of the source structure, or if like the hatchery style structure, or whatever that's hatching them, if that would be the only thing that you could target, or if you could target the eggs while they're gestating or what. But yeah, I think the egg slot thing, if it's a new race and you're building new muscle memory as a result, then that's like gives it more of a it allows you to be a little bit more open with what you're doing in some ways anyway. So I feel like that ends up helping. But so yeah, I guess there's another thing to think about as far as like, we've thought about different ways that we could maybe meditate or riff on the structure of Zerg macro. So it's kind of an interesting thing. And I suppose speaking of, riffing on things, the other thing that we have here before we get to the coffee questions is presenting Zerg in universe, right? And this is stuff that earlier today I forgot to date this episode. It's the 15th of August. Earlier today, I did a Discord stream where I was working on the Zerg tutorial and talked a little bit about how I plan to present Zerg. And I figure we can talk about that here because you and I had actually gone back and forth during that session on thoughts about it. So did you have anything to come in with immediately?
Well, I guess I can just say that so you've opened that stream session. I was just like, basically asking. You were actually asking yourself a question of how would you want to present it in an organic way.
Yeah.
Where it doesn't feel out of word or whatever, but actually still has all the useful stuff for the end player to experience. All the like tutorial-y, introductory, teaching, whatever, training stuff. Yeah. And basically then we had this more and more developing discussion about like what the Zerg is and how maybe they would like we introduced this idea of like survival of the fittest, how that would make sense, and how they are like so expendable that you can even use you could use your own like organ or whatever basically your own units, because they're so expendable. You could even train them against themselves, see some weaknesses, see some other stuff, figure out strategies. That's basically what I remember from what we have discussed. But yeah, there's some nomenclature and stuff that you can introduce because I'm not that familiar with it yet.
Yeah, so essentially, for those who are more familiar with the default Zerg echelon, how they're constructed and stuff, tendril is the term that we would use to probably, like, it would be equivalent to swarm, right? The entire swarm in classic StarCraft would basically be a tendril. And we have, like, many tendrils, so it's not, this is, like, equivalent to maybe, like, a Terran Nation or something, but obviously it's, like, an unfathomable amount of individual agents. Then instead of there being like cerebrates or broods, we have organs, and the organs are essentially like, this is like, for example, when you're fighting Zerg in one of the early campaign missions for To Touch the Sun, you are initially do battle with a seeding organ, and its like purpose is to start like laying the groundwork for future invasions, right? And like the brunt of it. Then there's hives, which are home to the cells of an organ. These are sometimes planet-side and sometimes they're orbital. Orbital hives obviously being something that we actually were building tiles for and stuff, so it's pretty interesting. Maybe we can get that. I actually opened that up again recently and tried to start working on it a little bit more. Tidied up some stuff, and I haven't made any new tiles for it, but I did adjust some and improve some. So that was kind of neat to get my feet wet with that again. And then on the individual level, like individual units and structures are called cells. So you've got the cells which stay at hives, and these cells make up organs, and the organs collectively belong to tendrils. So that's sort of the way that you could imagine their construction. The reason why this is all important to know is because, I tried to think of it like a body, like an actual living entity. And individual cells would, communicate with each other and with like, to some sort of controller or something that like handles the organ, right? So like that is sort of what the organ is like this organ's made up of cells. And if the tendril is like a body that's made up of organs, then the cells of the organs communicate certain information and data. The organ processes it and then sort of like the tendril is the thing that sort of discharges orders in a way. And so it's kind of like a more biological rendition of what the Overmind was, where you would imagine something like cells communicating data of their needs and what they're seeing and like what they might, again, what would be required to claim victory or something, and or like what they think, basically, like what the cell's instincts are in a way, and that would be communicated to the hive, or to the organ. And the organ would then make a decision within what it's capable of or whatever, and say like, okay, well, based on this information, I'm going to do this. And the tendril essentially is like the next level above that. It's like the brain of the operations, right? In some ways, but it's in many ways it's just made up of all of these like individual organs and stuff, which in turn are made up of individual cells. So it's an interesting biological take on a species, I think. But it's also
basically an analogy to human body, right?
Right. Yeah. And you, with all of that comes with the idea of like what could go wrong in the human body, right? You have autoimmune function, stuff that, maybe if this thing doesn't get what it needs, it withers and becomes weak or deficient. And maybe you could have like the equivalent of cancer, where basically like an organ could grow to an unsustainable state of numbers of cells, and that would result in it eventually, eating itself or something, right? And as a result, collapsing. And like what happens when you need to
you had the
recycle
example
this,
of KAG from like the Stormborn.
Right. So like one of the ideas that I had when you were going to be playing alongside KAG was actually that he would sort of be almost neutral hostile to you, where he can't, he has so many units, he can't actually control them all. That was like one of the ideas anyway. So like, he's like sending, he has like so many fucking Zerg. This is like where we wanted to add 1,000 Zergling or something back in the day. So this is like way back. But yeah, so that's like one of the ideas anyway, of like, that's sort of like the closest that I ever came to coming into that kind of concept, where it's possible for the Zerg to outgrow the domains and limits of the resources that are available to them, and that as a result, the end result of that will basically be that they are in a negative spot afterwards, right? They can't sustain what they've got, and as a result, it starts to eat itself, or destroy itself, or simply wither away and waste away.
And another thing that I brought up today was that if it behaves like an autoimmune system, basically there can be those diseases outside of cancer where like cells basically destroy the old ones, or whatever, the ones that are wrong. It destroys them, so it identifies the wrong ones and it destroys them. If it doesn't, it usually becomes cancer, right? But basically, what it can also do is attack the right cells, or whatever, the ones that are just fine, right? So you can have those diseases where, let's say, a Zerg cell would attack another Zerg cell just out of mistake, basically, because it's this like autoimmune disease allegory or whatever, analogy.
Right. Yeah, and so like, and obviously cells keyed to a specific organ in the human body analogy anyway, you can't, actually I'm not a fucking scientist, so I don't know this, but I imagine you can't easily repurpose cells from one organ to another without maybe some sort of surgical aid or some sort of like process that takes time. And, maybe we could even have the Zerg achieve that through their organic aspects, but that requires time. And so that's where you like have to drive you have to consume the organ, the withered organ in the tutorial as like your task, because if you don't, it will rejuvenate itself by defeating you. And but maybe it would still be withered or something. Maybe it would still be deficient in some other way later on or something.
I guess one idea that this talk gives me is like, what interesting implications would it have when, like, let's say Terrans try to like integrate, take control or whatever over like cells or something,
right?
And they basically go against the nature of the whole tendril system, and it just like fires back on them in the most unexpected ways, but still like very organic ways or something.
Yeah, you could almost imagine that like meddling from the other races could be seen as a virus or some sort of foreign pathogen, right? That's like, has unintended consequences down the line, and it would be destructive for the organ, but also destructive for whoever was trying to use it in a different way, just because they're coming at it from like the wrong approach. They don't have the right understanding of like how Zerg operate or whatever, right? So that could be like one thing to think about. Yeah, that's neat. The other idea here is like how to actually present dialogue if you're going to have this idea. And so Baleathal, this goes back to way back. Baleathal had this idea of like Zerg having dialogue as basically a chorus of disparate voices that merge together. And I definitely would need to do a lot of script testing for like making sure I wrote stuff in a way that isn't too flowery, but also isn't like, I don't want it to overlap with the other races. So it would definitely talk more matter-of-factly, I think, than Terrans, and certainly more than Protoss, but still in a way that should make it feel otherworldly, without you requiring to hear the voice acting. Like, obviously, I recommend hearing the voice acting, but, like, in theory, the dialogue itself, the written word itself should still feel, come across this air, present it itself in such a way. But it's actually a little bit difficult to imagine this being a human talking. And then when you hear the audio combined with it, it's like, oh, okay, yeah, that's absolutely something that's alien and foreign. And so that would be like the chorus part. And essentially that would be made up in many ways of the cells. So in the tutorial mission, you're just by yourself. You don't have an aide. You don't have like another character that's like giving you some sort of feedback or advice in the middle of the battle. That's what happens in the Terran one. But in the Zerg one, you just have you are the organ. You're supposed to be playing as the organ. That's the protagonist, if you want to call it that. Therefore, there's not really a character per se. But maybe if you send, you move agents and you move your cells right over to a certain area, they might you might get a chorus of a good place for defensive emplacements or something. I don't know, like something like that, right? Yeah. Something to the point.
Do you see any unit as potentially a cell, or how do you see?
Yeah. So like basically individual units and structures are cells, and they're gonna have different, presumably like individually. Right?
I could also imagine like agents being beneath cells. They're basically mindless. Like I would imagine Zerghereq7 to be one such thing, where maybe they are just the senses to the cell, but they are not themselves an agent or whatever. I think that could be interesting to explore or whatever.
Well, I think every cell or every individual unit and structure is basically used for data gathering and is like constantly providing data in an organic sense across the network, right? The hive mind. And that would be one way to think about what they're doing. So it's not that the Zerghereqs are speaking, because I do have a very strong aversion to fucking talking Zerg in StarCraft. I feel like it's like one of the stupidest things possible.
I guess the thing you're going at is like basically this network of cell being more than the sum of its parts.
Yes.
And it's basically emerging to its own thing, even though no part of it actually is the thing.
Yes. So what you should be able to understand that viscerally when listening to the voice acting part. Like that's the kind of part that needs to be done through the audio presentation, because the dialogue probably can't communicate that, or maybe over a long enough time, just purely reading stuff would be able to give you that. But hearing it, I think, should make it feel, I mean, like the biggest problem is it should feel identifiable as you are like listening to a specific organ talk. And so like the withered organ, if it communicated at all, would probably sound very different and maybe really, sick, ill, while your organ would be more vibrant and, new and full of life, because it's like this is its birth right here is what we're witnessing, what you're playing in the first tutorial mission. So I feel like that could work in a way. It's kind of interesting to think about it in those terms, because it's like, yeah, we have the opportunity in theory to build out this world and do this sort of like world building where like similar to, I talked with you about Rain of Sand, which is a campaign that I'm working on behind the scenes, and it has dialogue that's very different. It has like, that's the one that has like the pilot and the soul, if you remember that.
Oh yeah.
So like the dialogue doesn't really hold your hand about that. It just establishes things, or like it establishes things very naturally, and you're supposed to pay attention
them to you as a given.
Yes, there you go. Like this is a world where people know this information, and so they are not surprised by it, and you're supposed to piece it together, and you can, like it's written in a way that you can. It's accessible in that way, but you have to pay attention. So that's sort of like what I'm thinking here is like we should probably have something like that for the Zerg, where it's like we do this sort of world building.
I feel like it's actually just pretty fucking cool. I don't even know how else you would describe it, but it's basically the way. That kind of presentation, I think, is what usually would excite you about learning a world.
Yeah,
right?
Absolutely.
So, I think that's a really, really good way of going at it.
And I think that brings us to coffee questions. Are you ready for the first episode of Guest Prototype Coffee Questions Week?
Yeah, I mean, we did that in Crow's Nest, but it's first time in Prototype, so let's go.
Pretty epic. So All right, yeah, I guess I'll just take this opportunity to thank you and, of course, to thank the coffeeers in general. Obviously, this is coming on the backdrop of me. I'll say a few words here, but not much, and we don't need to linger on it. So there was a plan for me to go on this big trip, and now for reasons that, again, I don't really need to be gone into, it ended up falling through, and it didn't end up happening the way that it had been desired. So I appreciate both of the initial support. It was really, really awesome to see how many people were like, yeah, sure, I'll commission a bounty to support this sort of thing. And then some people did it without even wanting anything in return. And you yourself, Veek, actually gave half of what you were owed by your cut to me, and then the other half to the prize pool. And I thought that was a really nice gesture, and I appreciated that. And so, yeah, the support there, but when it was still in my mind, it was still a sure thing, and we were definitely going to do it. And the support afterwards, where the plans fell through, and that sucks. It was all really nice, and so I do appreciate everybody. It felt, that I felt that community behind me in that sense, and it definitely helps. It was really awesome when I was riding the high, and it was really awesome when I was picking myself off the floor, so to speak. So I do appreciate it, and I think it's pretty epic that we have this kind of community. And it's clearly, I mean, obviously, I see you guys playing the game every day. I see you guys, supporting the content, sharing it, talking about the project, engaging with the design, like what Fagudo did. Even just like he shares videos all the time, but he also was deliberately engaging with the designers, trying to get what he thought was going to be an improvement out, and like at least have some discussion about it. Like that's really awesome. But I will admit, even though I try not to talk too much about money and try not to make it too much about money, having the financial support in a time like this and in the times in the past, it's been really nice. And it's like just another way, it's orthogonal in some ways or parallel maybe, but it's like it's another thing that is reminding me that like people really do believe in the stuff that I'm doing. And while I believe in the stuff that I'm doing, and theoretically that should be enough, it's definitely something that helps and is nice. So I do appreciate you guys, and appreciate you too, Veek. Thanks for joining me for this episode.
Yeah, no problem.
It's been pretty cool. It has. Jumping into the Shambler's question. He asks a question about Xibalba. I don't know how much you'll be able to talk too much about Xibalba, Veek, but maybe there will be something in here in this answer that you catch on to. He asks, are there less impactful or lesser known phenomena in Xibalba outside of major regencies? And I do have to add some context because this is like the summary of his question. He said, scrolling. So he said, did the Emperor seat go colonizing on a world just to find it inhabited by sentient wind currents that fight back by redirecting all the oxygen away from a given area, or other similarly unexpected hazards? And that almost read to me like, I mean, props to him if he came up with that himself. It kind of reminds me of like the anomaly of the week that you would get out of like Star Trek or something, like old classic Star Trek. Very similar in that sense to me. It's like, damn, yeah, there's like all sorts of shit that we don't understand in this universe. I will say there's definitely going to be stuff that's like the equivalent of critters or maybe even neutral hostile or who knows for like different worlds. Part of that is going to be limited by budget and like time constraints. Like if we don't have the budget to make unique critters for every melee map or whatever, like that's understandable. But at the same time, it would be awesome if we could. And I think it would make sense, at least in some cases, for there to be like quirks of a specific thing that are bespoke to each map or battleground that make it so that like we went to this world. And obviously the ideal situation too is not just that there's something unique, but that it means something and there's a reason for it. So it's like reflected in the design of the world. Like if the world is supposed to be very harrowing and, make you think of, grim things or make you be on edge or be very dangerous, then maybe there'd be a lot of hazards in general that are like very, like this is a very brutal world where life only survives in the most like obscure of niches, or if it has to be really brutal in order to survive in the first place or something like that. Like it would want to be a reflection of something deeper than just, oh, this is unique, LOL, because that's cool, but it's not very substantive, right? So yeah, it's like finding a way for that to work in an RTS for gameplay, to work in the universe without it just being a rule of cool or something unique. And then also having the budget and time and et cetera to make that happen is kind of difficult. But I like in the universe, I have no problem with that existing. It's just that for it to exist in the game, you have to justify it. And so
I was thinking how we like compare Xibalba to like the real world.
Mm-hmm.
And in the real world, like most planets are, from what we know, inhabitable.
Yes.
And I think most planets are even gas giants, anyways.
Oh, I will say I think on Discord it sounded like you said inhabitable, but I assume you meant uninhabitable. Like it doesn't. You can't live there. Yeah. So just to clarify.
That's what I meant. And obviously, Xibalba is different because we do have those plans that you can play on.
Yeah.
And that's kind of a necessity for setting like that, and it's also a necessity from the RTS standpoint. But if we weren't doing an RTS, I would think, I would imagine a common occurrence would be those hazards and stuff.
Yeah,
So,
imagine like an
I feel
action
like
game or an exploration
Yeah,
game or
right.
something, you know? Like it would be totally cool to have something like the sentient wind currents or something.
Yeah.
You know, that would be really neat.
And I feel like every planet could have something unique about it because like you get different like elements, physical elements or whatever, and it just behaves differently. It's made up of different composition of like materials, different like natural flora or whatever, different atmospheric whatever, and yeah, I'd think anything but RTS would probably be pretty cool for that. But in RTS, it's probably kind of difficult to show that in gameplay and not be stupid gimmick, basically.
Yes, yeah, absolutely.
And obviously, if we are going for something, we would also want to show it, not exactly tell it.
Mm-hmm.
And what Lard does is they tell and they show the exact opposite, which we definitely don't want to do.
Yes, yeah. Well, the Protoss are, elevated creatures, and they're very intelligent. And meanwhile, here's them like abandoning their burning world that's being infested by Zerghereq so that they can arrest some fucker.
I do think what would be really cool is explore gas giants as actually playable planets, though.
No, as soon as you brought that up,
really,
dude, it's so crazy. As soon as you brought that up, I was thinking to myself, we should imagine like an orbital platform or something that was constructed and it's just surrounded by gas giant stuff, or like beneath it is like gas giants or something, or like what happens if you're if like canonically you're on the core of the gas giant, but I mean there's like a lot of gravity there. I don't know how the fuck you'd survive there, but like coming up with something to like do that, right? That would be really cool. It's sort of
it would be possible for like Psychora or something.
Yes, yeah. If you
could, definitely some potential for creativity for the more advanced races.
And maybe maybe you like it could be a setting of a melee map very easily because you're in a compound that's like reinforced against that, and it's by these advanced races, and you were teleported there or something. That's like the premise.
Maybe you would even like harvest energy from there or something, something like that. I imagine it could be really cool. I guess another thing to explore, but that's even more crazy, is like being at the edge of a black hole.
Yeah, I knew it was coming. Fuck yeah. Well, there's isn't there the idea of there's a certain idea of like a warp drive essentially that like fires a laser pointer around a black hole, and that's supposed to like be bent and give you like a push on the other side of it because it just goes so fast, right?
Right.
And like you would have to do it on, I think it's like a binary black hole system is the only thing you can do that in for it to be like more than one way, I believe is what I was told or what I remember hearing about it. So it's interesting as like an idea. I don't know how actually true it would be, but it would be cool to play around with stuff like that, or like like maybe you do have like you are actually like on the edge of a black hole somehow doing something. I recently did watch Interstellar like a couple weeks ago, and they have this scene where they like the gravity on a planet is like super high, and like it results in insanely high oceans and stuff. But the time dilation is enormous. So like you go down there because you're really close to a black hole. Like it could like just to be down there for like 20 minutes costs them like 17 years or something crazy like back on Earth, right? And so it's like really crazy stuff to think about. So yeah, I could see.
As far as I've heard, that's actually not how it works. I
don't think so. Yeah,
but in Xibalba, I think it does. So.
Okay,
yeah.
I like that. Just the laws of physics are slightly different because we said so. No, it's pretty cool. I mean, there is a genuine thing that like because Xibalba takes place chronologically, if humans existed in the universe that Xibalba is in, they were like millennia and millennia and millennia ago, like ages ago, like a real long fucking time ago. So the idea being that like the planet, like the universe is at a more mature stage, and that's why you see so many different life forms, like intelligent life forms, because like there's a genuine thing called grabby aliens, which is basically a theory that like we probably exist early on in the universe's lifespan. Well, because we do that, we can know that because like, excuse me, if there was going to be a an empire, like aliens would probably be grabby in that sense. They would try to like grab a lot of land and territory and expand very fast. And even at sublight speeds, you would still be able to catch that. Like, I forget what the reasoning and explanation is for why you could see that. But because we see no evidence of that, this theory basically implies we're too early in the universe for vast numbers of alien species. I think that's really cool to think about. So, yeah, as soon as I heard that, I was like, that makes perfect sense for Xibalba. It takes place like, 10 billion years in the future, and that's why, or something, I don't know exactly how far away. So anyway, the reason why I'm bringing that up is, dude, in however many billion fucking years it is, maybe there are like these ancient installations or something that are really high tech or whatever that like work in the context of a black hole or a gas giant. And like maybe this is just known how to do by then. So, or maybe like terraforming is more common. So you can somehow convert a gas giant into a terrestrial planet. And maybe it's by like bringing in the fucking, asteroid belt in the local system and being like, all right, time to start fucking crashing these things. I don't know. Like, I don't know how they would do it, but like, who knows? Like,
I mean, I assume it would be some chemical reaction or something. And maybe you would have to use like some chemicals from the asteroids. I don't know. Something you could think of, and with high tag, it's probably possible. Right?
Yeah. So there you go.
I'm always curious if, in such a mature universe, in terms of like the years it exists, if the stability of the universe wouldn't be somewhat broken or whatever. It feels like with so many regencies, with so much crazy tech, I could see like it being plausible for law of physics to like essentially alter a bit because of like basically what things were been done, and like you have all the like planes manipulations with like Psychora where they have the fourth dimension and stuff. So it feels like when you're even touching like things like fourth dimension and time, you're definitely are somewhat able to alter the laws of physics somehow, right? I don't know exactly how you would want to explain it, but it's something interesting to think about, I think.
Well, there's a couple of reasons why that might not negatively impact the stability of the setting, and some of it could be that just doesn't happen, and another explanation could be that there are forces at work that counteract it and reestablish homeostasis, right, within the setting. So
right, there are even some regencies that basically fight for homeostasis or whatever the name is.
Yes, yeah, for the opposite of entropy, I guess, or whatever. Yeah, I don't know. Right. So yeah, something like that. Like the status quo is preserved by something more powerful.
What I meant is not necessarily that it would be a bad thing. It's just it would be interesting to consider the ramifications if such a thing could occur, right?
Yeah, so you could even imagine it like maybe there's a reason why there's a rivalry between some regency and Psychora, because Psychora are seen as not just like interlopers from another dimension, but also as destabilizers of this universe, that could be like one example. I don't know, like I can't think of an immediate. Maybe it would be Cathethrons or something, because like the Psychora have an extra spatial dimension, whereas the Cathethrons benefit from time. So there's like different aspects there, which is kind of interesting to think about. But yeah, so anyway, there's some Xibalba lore for you and some discussion as a result for Shambler's question. And thanks for the support, dude. So, all right, I guess we'll move on to HelltRYKS' question here. He asks, do you pity the fool who doesn't follow the No Frauds Club? And Veeqhere, I almost think this is like a bit of a troll question or something. Like, you don't follow the No Frauds Club. What are you, not crow-pilled or something? You loser?
I'd want to just say to remember to subscribe to our No Frauds Club channel on YouTube. It has pretty cool videos. It has interviewed Jonathan Blow himself and a few other really
I interviewed Jonathan
people,
Blow 3 times.
Yeah.
That's pretty stupid. Pretty awesome, but pretty dumb. Yeah. Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, there's definitely some
pity the fools.
Pity the fool who doesn't subscribe to that channel because they're missing out on content. I'll say that there's a time and a place for our content insofar as like this is not the apex, right? Like we call our tournaments Ascension because we're ascending, like in some way. Like that's another thing. I mean, obviously I call it that because it's recognizable from Artosis's Ascension tournament. But
I feel like Myrian, I think it was Myrian who commented recently that. Oh, maybe it was that Ascension tournament that you told me to check out. But there was like a comment on a YouTube video that like, oh, imagine if this was played at year 2000. That's legitimately what I dreamed of or something.
Yes, yeah, that was Stratus Tygo who left a comment.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Maybe.
Yeah.
It's pretty cool to see that.
Yeah, it's pretty epic. Like the fact that you can get a game like that, like the match on Death Spiral that almost went an hour. It ends in a pretty unceremonious, like anticlimactic way or whatever. But up until that point, it was pretty fucking epic. And even in a way, the way that it ended is also kind of epic. It's just like, well, it's not the kind of epic we would really want, but it was still like interesting, I guess. Yeah, like the lead up there, the build up was really neat. Is like you could tell that both players were tired and like they kept trying like different things and like how can we do it? And they're exploring the tech trees like in different ways, and all sorts of stuff. And it's like it's really cool to see stuff like that. So yeah, being able to see the extent of it, that's like a prototype of what our future games will be, guys. Like they'll be good like that. Like they'll be, you'll be having all of this other stuff. So yeah, I would say
Prototype with a 0 instead of first O.
Yeah.
By the way.
Yeah. By the way. Yeah, I don't know. It's so cool. It's like, yeah, that's the kind of stuff that I always dreamed of as far as that first match goes. Like it's the stuff of Legends, but also, dude. Like we can get so much better than even that in our future games, and even within CMW probably too, right? But like in our future games, we can get even better than that. So yeah, that's really awesome. And I won't say that I pity the fool. I would simply say there are going to be people who realize what they're missing out on, who maybe wished that they were part of the journey sooner, but whenever they're ready to take the crow pill, so to speak, or to even just entertain the idea that like we might be on the right track, to give us a shot, to give us a chance to prove ourselves to them. Whenever they do that, it's going to be pretty based. Like they're going to have a really good time, basically. So I think that's more. I won't say that I pity anybody. I don't even think anybody's making a mistake by like maybe they heard of us, but they're like, dude, these guys definitely aren't real or legit. Like, yeah, well, we're just some people on the internet. Like we don't have. People are conditioned to think that like, you know, corporations are the only ways that you can be saved. Is like, you know, like the actual corporate game designers, right? The people from Frost Giant Studios and stuff. It's like we think that's laughable, like but you know.
You reminded me of like some screenshots of those people from like some Patrick on the server, and there were like people saying that you would do WASD for mining or something. It was really funny. They legitimately hated TNFC for no reason, just to I don't know, just to be weird, I guess.
Well, they didn't like me, and I had no idea who they were, and it was very surreal because I didn't think I had haters like that who I literally don't know who they are, but they absolutely despise me. It's like, what the fuck? So that was funny. But yeah, no, I don't. I think eventually, you know, if people want to come around to the ideas that we have, or they want to give us a chance or whatever, that's totally fine. And eventually, I mean, I have a feeling our games are going to spread far and wide in the RTS crowd, and people are going to really be surprised at what they see. And again, we think this is the future of the RTS. Like, we think that match on Death Spiral is like, that's an example. And maybe the ZBZ I'm casting later today is also going to be an example. We'll see. But like that match on Death Spiral is like, okay, besides the ending being a bit anticlimactic, like that is kind of the thing that you might see. The level of play could be better, obviously, like player skill or whatever, but that's the kind of thing that you could at least achieve in a match of parity, like a match between evenly skilled players. Like that could be a thing that you see. And it's just like so epic the way that it unfolds. So highly recommend watching that if you haven't. And definitely like one example where it's like, dude, that's on the low end of epic for what we can achieve for sure. But it still is epic. It still qualifies. It's just like, that's interesting. That's compelling. So yeah, I think people they'll have to admit that we did something right, I think. And even if they don't, like, well, whatever, we got all these people who think that we do. So I'm not bothered by it personally. So Myrian does ask a question.
Let's get to Myrian question.
Yeah, he says, what is your opinion on individuals modifying the No Frauds Club's work? And he adds context of saying, you know, porting assets from a previous product to make or start a new Regency, faction, tile set, etc., creating micro missions or mini games that have nothing to do with playing an RTS. So like, I think what we said, we've talked about this before, at least the last part, Veeq, right? Because I've imagined like, because somebody had made like a shitty UMS map in CMVW, and I was like, dude, this is kind of embarrassing. Like, I can't believe my work is being used this way. But I also was like, you know, it's like, that's a funny tongue-in-cheek response almost. It's like, realistically speaking, I'm not going to give you express like support, or like, we're not going to like actively try to update the handling of the game to support something that's not intended, right? So we're not going to like give you tools to make better micro missions, because the game isn't really about micro missions. But if the tools that we do have are used in that way, then yeah, that's fine. And if you modify the game or the engine or whatever, I mean, we're not going to be releasing source code for the engine. I think we decided. I don't know to what degree we'll have modability for the actual game. We definitely want to allow players or designers, right, community content creators, to develop their own shit. So I would say, and if they port, assets from like, say, Pangea into Onatar or Onatar into CM Retail or whatever, like, I'm sure somebody would do that. Like, why wouldn't they? Like, it's kind of obvious. It's like all the people who tried to port Brood War into Warcraft or vice versa or whatever, or like StarCraft 2 into StarCraft 1 for some reason. Like, they've even gone the other way. So yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if people tried to do stuff like that. And I certainly wouldn't try to stop them. I would just say, when you're going out of your way to do something that is not like within the default bounds, you shouldn't expect like what would you say? You shouldn't expect like everlasting and boundless support for something where, yeah, you can actually just do every single thing that you want to do. That's just not going to happen. Like, if for that to happen, you'd have to make your own engine, right? So we're going to stick with what works for us, is my thought. I mean, obviously you can comment more on the specifics or technicals, but like, that's sort of
since the beginning, I never felt like I actually want to make quote unquote an engine, because that has failed in the past, I think. Like, things are like Unreal and Unity are not really that great. They just produce mediocrity, right?
Right.
And I just don't think they're that great of a thing. And I think it's one, less performant, two, less efficient, and free. But it just feels so much worse than just making a game and tailoring the quote-unquote engine for it. Just basically having the source code for the game and not worrying about making it super reusable. Because that super reusable stuff, it's actually a cost both on productivity and on the final game's performance.
Yes,
and probably on stability, because once you're doing very reusable stuff, it's very often that you get very weird bugs that you would never expect. And that, I'm pretty sure, has plagued StarCraft 2 a lot, where they like changed stuff and just like random other things completely broke. I don't exactly remember the example, but that's basically what I've heard. And that's what usually happens with all the like abstracted stuff, and I would really not want that to happen. But at the same time, I don't mind. Just like, if we have something that we use and that can be exposed fairly easily without having to expose the source code / rebuild the game, then we probably can expose that to the public, and it's probably fine.
Yeah, my thinking is basically, if we can make it so that what I use as the game designer and data entry person to actually do the data entry and definitions for units and etc. to make a race rather. That's like, if we can do that, then great. Yeah. Like, that's basically what we would want, right?
And there's even more hope, but that I will leave for the next question.
Oh shit. The next question is 3 Crows. He says, will full releases of TNFC projects support fully featured level editors? Do you think your level editors will be robust enough to allow for other kinds of game modes? So these are kind of, obviously there's like 2 separate questions in there, but like, take it away, Veek. You already said you had some stuff, so.
Yeah, so to the first question, I'll just say yes. We do plan to have a level editor. We already even have it implemented in Antikythera. So I mostly will be talking about Antikythera here, since this is the only quote-unquote engine that we have, and we have not even theorized exactly how the workflow would work for, let's say, an FPS game, right?
Yeah.
So this is exclusively RTS stuff. But yeah, we do have a level editor. It's even, you can even use it cooperatively with someone. You can just connect and build your map together.
Yeah.
And level editor is a level editor currently, so it only edits a level. It's pretty usable, I guess, although it has some pretty major caveats that we would want to fix sooner or later.
It's not ready yet, but it does the job for level design right now.
And I think as long as your game custom map would use the same assets as like the original game, you would probably be fine. Like isometric, any kind of isometric stuff, you could probably even import to the game. And yeah, that's all good in terms of level design. But coming to the second question, it's not exactly that our level editor will allow for different kinds of game modes, because we don't have classic triggers like a CM draft does. But we have something called Kairos that I've been working on for like a month before I went to my work. And it's this language that's basically for doing triggers and AI, and it's I believe it's very powerful and easy to use, even, I would say. And basically, after we expose enough functionality to that language, I think you'll be able to really make amazing stuff that you wouldn't be able to make in like StarCraft 1, StarCraft 2, whatever. Age of Empires, even. I don't know what is the most notable game outside of Brood War, but I believe it would be way better for that than even CBW. So, yeah, that's the glimmer of hope that I give you. And even though this language is not planned to be used for like unit behaviors, because it's not exactly the most performant thing, maybe at some point we do expose it if it's optimized enough and it can do like proof of concept races or whatever well or something. I don't know. But for triggers, I think you'll be more than enough equipped to do cool stuff. And I guess another game that does use heavy trigger stuff is Warcraft 3, I guess. So StarCraft 2 and Warcraft 3 definitely had a lot of trigger,
right,
like arcade stuff with like completely custom game modes. And I think you'll be able to do probably even better than that. I do plan to expose you to have things like UI, custom UI stuff that you also had in those games. So
especially, I think Warcraft 3 had that mostly with the remaster, which obviously was stupid and refunded actually. But the StarCraft 2 game obviously had like you could customize a load of stuff. It was probably just very jank because I think it was like some scripting language, not Lua, but something like it. Galaxy. Oh my god. Basically,
I never used Galaxy. I used the trigger editor for the most part, and it's whatever. It's not bad. It's not very bad, I guess. It's not very performant, but I think it was one of the first things I even used when I learned programming. So, like even before I learned programming. So,
right.
Some trivia for you.
So
I don't think it's very. It's not Kairos, but it's usable, I guess.
Now, the one thing that those other editors, Warcraft 3 and StarCraft 2, have over something like Star Edit or even SCM Draft is that you can... Oh, actually, this is something that we don't technically have in Antikythera yet, is the ability to modify unit stats, which you can even do in, Star Edit or whatever. So that part...
We only have that as text editing now.
So I don't know if, like... I don't know what kinds of modifications you would be able to make in that sense, where you basically have your own like version of the game's data files. Obviously, there was like various solutions to those in SCM Draft / Star Edit for StarCraft 1, and also like a different one for Warcraft 3 and a different one for StarCraft 2. They had like dependencies and stuff that they introduced over the time of the game. Yeah, because they originally started with MPQs, just like the other games, but eventually changed over to Cask and did a bunch of other shit. So basically, we're not really sure how we're going to go about exposing that, but am I right to say, Veek, that we do want to allow players or modders or whatever, developers to just in the same, like in the map, at least maybe specify a different set of definition files?
Yeah, I don't know if it would be like in the map, like a CM draft, but I imagine you should be able to just package basically package like an MPQ style file with each map or with each map pack, and they would basically contain like some. Basically, you would be able to define custom units or replace stuff or whatever, and you would also be able to contain all the scripts and AI stuff.
We kind of have a little bit of that with some stuff in CMBW already, if you think about it, where you can import like files to the map and then load them using custom triggers. Obviously, we would be talking essentially about like if you had just one like campaign MPQ file in a folder, and then in the in the same folder as like all of your campaign missions or whatever. And then like you open up the mission or the level or whatever, and you can like in the trigger editor you can specify, hey, this is where we want to load this extra dependency for data, and that would like have more units in it or something. Like that would be another thing to maybe think about, but I don't think we'll be able to achieve that in CMBW. It's not a focus anyway. But like that would be like the next evolution of that. And then in Antikythera, we're talking about being able to do that much more easily because we have like total source control of everything.
Which does actually come with our responsibility, and some things don't come as easily as they would seem, basically. So.
Well, we also need to worry about like security to some degree, right? I mean, depending on what's actually possible to use in the editor or in the game.
Yeah, it feels like in the mod we don't basically have to worry about it because we just have a community, and like if someone is a known cheater, probably no one would play with them. So.
Yeah, right.
And it's not like we do have to worry about it that much, but in terms of a full game, it's a bit more difficult.
Yes.
But yeah, it's good to have responsibility because that means we have total control, but it also means that we have the responsibility, and it means that we need to spend the time on the stuff, polish it up, and it's not always great the first few attempts or whatever. So,
well, there you go. And there is a little bit more about editors and maps in specific. Ben Taberski himself asks, what are your general thoughts on how map layouts will look like in future games? And so
I guess I'd want to comment on the current state of the levels in Brood War, in CMBW specifically. Because I have felt that your maps, BTB, and other maps have improved a lot, and I've been more and more pleased with them. I felt like I myself also improved, which is nice. I've made this recently. I've made Waterloo, the 3v3 map, and I've been very happy about how it at least felt when I made it. We'll see if in practice it's that good of a map, but it does feel like we've had some lessons learned, and it's more and more enjoyable to play on CMBW maps compared to what it maybe used to be. So I think it's pretty neat to see the growth there, and I am hopeful for the future, but you can comment more, I guess.
Yeah, I think what Ben was thinking about here was more like the actual nuts and bolts construction of what maps look like. Like, are they going to have, like, what is the layout or whatever, right? So, like, I would say one of the big game changers is definitely going to be in Antikythera. You can just stack cliffs as much as, well, not as much as you want, but you have a lot more levels than 3. And it's the layers as well allow you to basically, like, instead of needing to manually place tiles, for example, you can just place tiles and then change their sorting as you will, and all this other stuff. And, there's all sorts of stuff that's related to that. You can place doodads off the grid or on the grid. You can obviously place ramps in various ways, and, there's all that stuff. So, like, that's really good. That's neat to see. You can obviously do tints and changes like that. So if you wanted to have, like, oh, this is a higher level cliff, and the convention is tinted up a little bit so that it's a little bit brighter, then you can actually do that yourself and like customize that how you want. And then, we don't yet have like I don't think we have like a global recolor or something similar to the recolor script or trigger.
We don't yet.
So like that would be something to eventually add so that we could actually have like, nighttime lighting, for example. And again, this time it wouldn't affect the UI. Wow. Imagine the way you can do it when you don't have a fucking palette. Stuff like that. Right. So, so there's all sorts of stuff that's kind of interesting to think about. As far as the general look of things. And because we're rendering all of the tiles ourselves and with consistent lighting, we know that like the lighting is always the same. So that way, when we change the lighting for everything, for example, for like, if we're going to go through and change a global lighting for like nighttime, then it's going to affect all tiles the same because they're all rendered with the same default lighting to begin with, right? Whereas in Brood War, we're taking assets from different tile sets, and even on the same tile set, sometimes it looks like the lighting configuration is different. But then it might also be the product of the palette. So either way, it's like it's a bit more hit or miss as to whether or not you're able to actually achieve a desired look. Like trying to do, for example, a daytime recolor on Twilight is almost impossible, I think. It might not actually be feasible because that's just because like the palette is too restricted, and also you would want to probably do more than just change shadows and highlights and stuff, but like you could probably do something that's like at least passable that way. I don't know if the palette can actually support it though, so that's like its own issue. But yeah, so anyway, like at the very least, the ability for you to make cliffs and make all the tiles look different. Like, funnily enough, because we don't have an asphalt tile in the game yet for Pangea, when I was last working on maps for that, I took grass and like significantly darkened it and made it so that it looked like tar almost, or like some sort of not tar. I was thinking like tarmac, like at an airport, but obviously we're thinking of like a road of some kind, and it's not really convincing, but like at least it looks different enough that you can't immediately identify it as grass unless you really study like the silhouette of the tiles and stuff. And it's like at least okay, yeah, sure, whatever. That's like my placeholder road, going back to minimum viable product and stuff. So. I think that's pretty neat and works as far as like a baseline. Like this is my placeholder.
Yeah, reflecting back, reflecting again on the current state of things, I do feel like the way, at least I think of making a layout has changed a bit, and I do start to think way more about how like the pathways goes and stuff like that. And speaking of that, one thing that we wanted, and I know you wanted for sure, is like having new interactive elements where you have like, for example, doors. I guess that's more for scenarios, but having doors, and then for like mini games, you definitely would want like destructible pathways that you can open or whatever.
Well, I would imagine that you could even see doors in Melee games too, because as long as it's a map, a neutral map object similar to like the anchor, like okay, if I put a unit here, then I control the door or something, you know, like
would you have like a control panel or something? I don't know.
Yeah. Maybe. So if it's something like that where, and maybe you can blow up the control panel and then they just force open or something. I mean, you'd have to explain why that happens in a.
Maybe they freeze in the state.
Yeah, I could see that working as well. So that like whatever, you can freeze it in that state if you want to, and then maybe somebody can repair it if they want to too. I don't know how it would work if it's going to be permanently interactable, or it's like a decision to similar to like right now we have the neutral Nidocesians, and it's like. They start off, and you can choose to attack them to destroy them, or you can choose to just go through them, and you decide when to blow them up so that pathway is permanently cut off. And like this is most notable in Infinite Velocity, because that's the map that like was the first one to really start using this in a mega way. So
yeah, it's the first 1v1 map to ever use Nidoses, I think.
Yes, yeah. Well, before there were blockers that blew up on their own, the map was very volatile, as you might imagine. Some would say the map is still volatile, but that's another thing too. Is like going back to what you were saying, is like reflecting on your growth as a mapper and like how your approach of things, how your thoughts on things have changed. I would say it's a similar vibe. Like I have grown to appreciate safety, and even while I was building the tutorial map today, because the AI is never going to like drop you in cliffs behind your base or your mineral line or whatever, I was like. Even despite the fact that the AI will never do that, I was thinking to myself, this would be totally like going against like what my current design sensibilities are for Melee maps, because you can just get absolutely owned by air units or drops, and it's just like inviting that into your life basically. I had there's definitely some concerns about shit like that, where it's like, bro, definitely don't do this. Like this is just ridiculous. So it's something where it's like there's definitely a need to consider that, and I think we've generally been going in a direction of making maps safer. I know obviously Veeqhere with Proxima, and then Repulsion, and some of the other maps like Equilibrium, and then lately with your most recent 1v1 map Nightfall have gone for a more safe opener where there's always like a ramp into a natural and stuff. And I've always liked the idea of you deciding which base to take for different reasons. So, that's led me to make more open maps, but then there's like less safety. So it's like the push and pull you have to think about, right? So yeah, there's definitely like back and forth in the design, but I do think we're generally going in a direction of more safe maps, even in team games.
Right.
So I think that's going to help out a lot for approaching
things.
I
feel like we should still like explore the thing about like choosing your natural, because that does sound like a very good idea, but usually it was so open that you would just get abused.
You would never really get to the point where you have a natural. This game would end too
fast.
So yeah.
I guess with a different game state or something, maybe.
Yeah, if it was just like slower in general, and maybe we can try to do something more freeform in some, like, we've talked before about how Pangea is supposed to be a bit slower and stuff, so that might be one example. But yeah, it's something to think about for sure. I don't know if you had any other thoughts on Bin's question here, but that's sort of where I'm thinking is like in future games.
Yeah, I mean, more freeform, I think we'll just see how it flows, and
Yeah.
when we just explore stuff, get some more feedback, engage with the loop a bit, and see what works, what doesn't, what we would want, what maybe feels like a natural follow-up to some changes or whatever. I think the cliff system is a big thing, though, because you don't have to create like artificial walls or whatever with like... Currently, you would probably use like water or like tank holes or something to like create negative space, and with cliffs you can just make the cliff will be the wall, unpathable thing, right? So it completely changes the way you can shape maps, and it's really, really cool.
And you imagine when we have like doodads that face to the cliffs, that would look pretty good, because like they would be agnostic to the idea of how many levels there were, because like maybe it's a 1-level doodad or maybe it's a 2-level doodad or something. Like I wanted this really, really big staircase from Balethal, and it was supposed to be able to go up like 3 whole levels of cliff at a time or something. So like you can even have options like that are really cool.
Yeah, and then you just get plus 20 attack range.
Absolutely slapped. Yeah, I guess like the other thing we'd have to triage is like the ramp itself would need some indication of what height level you're at.
We'll actually be able to like have things like Zamaga turrets, but actually organic or whatever.
Oh yeah,
like
because if you
like
just put a unit there, suddenly you have like plus 10 vision, and like this one unit becomes really good. So that could be really neat. That's something I hadn't thought of. The other thing I guess that's worth mentioning here is because I feel like this question was more about the meta of map making as opposed to like talking about like what tools are going to change and how that's going to maybe change map layouts and stuff. And so like thinking about that, Boskovian is a map that has like a lot of these issues where you can drop everywhere and all this other stuff, and like there's a lot of drop holes that haven't been plugged. And
eventually we'll have like painting collision.
Yes. Yeah, so being able to paint an area as unpathable, or change the height level manually, maybe. I don't think we'll need that, actually, now that I think about it. But that's because we'll just have infinite cliff. Well, not infinite, a lot of cliff levels, and because we have a lot of cliff levels and painting pathing, then that kind of covers us for everything that we need. So a map like Boskovian can be a lot more well articulated in something like Antikythera, because you can choose what to do. And like ideally, we were talking about this before, Veek, is like if you're going to be able to paint unpathability, maybe it should like darken the terrain or something, because we want some sort of read for the player to know that like, okay, that's not pathable. But I'm not really sure what would be good for that for all cases. Like maybe we would rely on the map maker to paint it as unpathable and then like add a bunch of doodads there or something to indicate that. So,
because what I was considering for a while is like this brush system. I mean, I guess you have mentioned wanting a brush system a while ago, but I don't know if I exactly interpreted it right when I've heard about it. But what I was wondering somewhat recently, so probably a few months back, is having like a brush system where you can actually subtile paint stuff, and I guess it would be sort of like Zerghereq 2, where you do paint stuff, but then I just thought that maybe you combine it with layer system, so you just make a layer, because I guess you'd have to, with this new system, you'd have to keep isometric cliffs, a separate system from like textural brush layers or something.
Yes, yeah.
But maybe you could also assign collision to a brush layer, so you'd maybe have like, I don't know, let's say you would have crevices brush, and you would paint it, and then you would mark it as like unbuildable and collision, and you would also like color shift it or something.
And so like basically one layer would have all of the details. So when you paint this layer somewhere, it also carries with it, when this is painted somewhere.
And I guess you could also assign it no texture if you just want to paint the flags.
Yeah. Yeah, okay.
So that could work. And basically what I was thinking, it would be sort of like a smaller grid, but basically each cell of the grid would be like it's like bilinear. Like the scaling from Photoshop is named the same, right?
Yeah.
So we could use that, let's say, algorithm to basically paint the texture. Yeah. So basically, each cell would have intensity of that layer and whatever, and it would automatically like blend the way you would be used to from like Zerghereq 2 or whatever.
Yeah, because I do like the fact that with terrain in that game, you can try to achieve more organic looks. I mean, setting aside the graphics not being very high fidelity, it's like the fact that you can merge the different terrain layers gives you a lot of opportunity for decor. Like I remember painting some kind of like mechanical thing and then trying like a mechanical tile, and then as a way to make it like look overgrown, I painted like vines but in like a pattern around like the stones or like the panels or something. So like it wasn't just random vines, it was like vines in a specific area. And like you can't really do that with isometric tiles in the same way. You're a bit more limited to like doodads. So if you did want to be able to do some kind of painting like that for massive decor, then I mean that would be good. We'd just have to make sure it's usable and also performant, because I think there's a problem right now where if you have like a lot of tile layers, even in the games running, I don't think it bakes them down, right? Because it's theoretically you can just change it at any point because you can swap to editor mode. So we don't really have a concept for that.
I tried baking them once and it was really bad because DirectX is really bad.
Oh right, yeah, because it couldn't draw.
It was like very blurry for some reason. It was like
I remember you. I think there was performance issues too because
off.
it was like one big monolithic file or something. So I don't know. I'm not sure why optimization.
It wasn't baking into a file. I was basically caching the texture of the map, you could say.
Oh right,
as a whole, and then trying to render it, and it was very blurry and it didn't really work.
But it being one single texture probably is one of the reasons for that. But maybe it's just DirectX being terrible. I don't know. Like maybe there's a way to round that. But anyway, that's just something that I remember thinking of is like, oh, maybe this is going to be a problem in the future. But anyway, that's sort of I guess that's sort of the situation is there's going to be new tools and better usability and better, like, the experience of being a mapper is going to be much better. So that alone is going to unlock a lot more productivity. Like one of the reasons why I very rarely decor my maps right now, especially if they're in the needs testing folder, is because it takes so fucking long to place the tiles to begin with to make the map functional if I'm doing anything custom. So when my time is a bit more precious, and thankfully I'll have a little bit more time these days, but when it's a little bit more precious, it's like, okay, well, do I really want to sit here and paint tiles for like, an extra 2 hours to finish this map's decoration? Or maybe that's not even going to be enough. Maybe I have to do like more than 2 hours to finish the map's decoration because of that.
And then the other issue, which is less of an issue, but still an issue, is that you don't get mirroring on like resources and doodads and stuff like that.
Yeah, there's a lot of things that sap at your time, right? And because of that, them not doing that, because of it being better software, the editor for
I really wish I could just like prototype maps quicker, because then I would be able to iterate my my skills just would more quickly improve because I would be able to test more things. And
well, it's the drills in for the players, but as a mapper, right? And you can't really do that because SEM draft still is not open source, so owned.
Yeah.
I guess that probably brings us to a close here. We do have one last message, and it's Alexhandr, who says, no question, just love. And well, we love you too, dude. Thanks.
Yeah.
Big ups on this guy. And everybody else who supported us and did actually ask a question. And even the people who didn't ask a question and didn't send a message and just sent us money instead. Threes are an acceptable form of messaging. In fact, money is speech. Didn't you know that, according to America? Because that's definitely not Honk Nation on Discord. But you can check us out on Discord, and you can join us.
I think there's like a saying that actions speak louder than words.
So threes speak louder than actions.
Also, yeah.
Yeah, there you go. The natural course of things is when you add a third thing, it's epic. So this brings us to our show outro, and I don't know if there's really anything in particular that's left to speak of. Oh, I guess there was the one question of like, I don't know if you can really talk about this, but you mentioned that you had this like day off, which is why you could record this. Do you foresee an opportunity for you to be able to have a bit more time to do stuff like shows? Because we could obviously just go back to doing Crow's Nest and I talk a little bit more.
I can probably find some time on weekends.
Okay.
But it really depends on what my plans on a weekend are, and I just spend significant time in work, so
right.
Especially bad when I'm going to office, because then there's like 2 hours spent on just traveling.
Yep.
Which is pretty annoying.
Yeah.
But the work's been pretty good, so and they also pay me fairly well, so it's decent.
Yeah, I guess a more general question would just be how have you been liking it, but it sounds like it's been pretty good.
Yeah, it's good, and the time, I don't know. It's just like after coming back from work, sometimes it just feels like I don't want to call off from work because I might be tired or whatever, and then I'm just spending time with family or something.
And that's important, and that makes sense too. So I'm not trying to give you a shit for that. It's more so like if you think you could actually make time for it, if it's not just Yeah, if it's not the only reason. That
Yeah, when I have a window and I see like something to be done, I'm usually trying to give it a shot. And yeah, I think it would be nice to record a Crow's Nest at some point. And
there you go. Well,
cool.
Happy holidays to whatever fucking holiday is going on in Poland. And thanks for giving us Veeqhere for an episode of Prototype. And thanks to everybody who has supported us. And of course, thanks to the number 3.
Yeah. Bye.